Hi, I'd like to wish everyone a warm welcome who is joining us for this special May Day rally organised by Socialist Alternative. I'd like to say thank you for taking the time for joining us this evening. My name's Paul. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative and I'm a union shop steward, and I'm going to be chairing the rally tonight. We've got some fantastic speakers who we will introduce shortly. But before we do, to ensure as many of your friends see this rally as possible, please like the video, share the post and set up watch parties and invite all of your friends to it. Now, so to introduce our speakers, all our trade unionists tonight will be speaking in a personal capacity. We've got some fantastic speakers for you this evening. We're very happy to welcome Hannah Swoboda from Chicago, who's a member of Socialist Alternative in the United States. We also have Fiona Pashazadeh, a worker in higher education and a member of the Universities and Colleges Union. We have Rob MacArdle, who's a postal worker and a member of the Communication Workers Union. We have Yara, who's a member of Socialist Alternative in North London, who'll be making a short contribution. And to close the rally, we have Chaz Berry, who's a member of the National Association of Probation Officers. Now, today is a special day for working class people and the oppressed around the world. It's May Day, or International Workers' Day, where we come together to discuss past and current struggles, how we organise to end the nightmare of capitalism and fight for a socialist future. And I think the need for a socialist alternative is ever more valid at this time of the Covid-19 crisis. And just to say, in the UK alone, at least 26,000 people have died, which is likely to be an underestimation. Many frontline workers, whether that's in health, social care or transport, have lost their lives. People are also going to be losing their jobs. And there's no doubt there's going to be more to come as the capitalist class and the Tory government want working class people to pick up the tab. Now, our job as socialists is to fight back against this and build struggles and an organisation that can fight back. And May Day is a perfect time to talk about all of this. So our first speaker will be Hannah from Socialist Alternative in Chicago in the United States, who's going to talk about the radical and revolutionary roots of May Day. So over to you, Hannah.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on this call. I'm excited to get into some of the history that took place here in Chicago. So today marks a day of global struggle, which has been memorialized on May 1st for over 100 years as International Workers' Day. To this day, this is a legal holiday in more than 80 countries, and it's unofficially celebrated in many more, where workers mark the day by going to mass demonstrations. But why do we celebrate May 1st as International Workers' Day? The origin of May Day traces back to the struggle for a shorter workday, and more specifically to the movement for the 8-hour workday starting in the United States after the Civil War. But the history goes back even further than that. The struggle for a shorter workday essentially dates back to the beginning of the factory system in the US. Already beginning in the 1800s, workers in the US pushed back against their long work hours. 14, 16, and even 18-hour days were common. So in the 1820s and 30s, there were a bunch of strikes demanding a shorter workday, and this soon grew into a broader movement. Feeling the pressure of this movement, the federal government passed a law instating a 10-hour day for all those who were employed on government work. But this didn't go nearly far enough, and the struggle for the universality of the 10-hour day continued during the next decades. And after securing this concession of a 10-hour day for workers in some industries, workers raised their expectations and started demanding an 8-hour workday. Flash forward a few decades to the American Civil War. In order to open up the country to modern capitalist development, the Republican Party fought the Civil War to end slavery in the South. Afterwards, beginning in 1867, they passed the Reconstruction Acts, which were supposed to uphold the rights of free slaves in the former Confederacy, and they simultaneously passed laws limiting the working day to 8 hours as a concession to the labor movement in the North. So while these laws existed on paper, they didn't translate into any real material change. There was no enforcement and no mechanism was established to do so. Workers had to take matters into their own hands. Winning the 8-hour day, as well as dismantling Jim Crow laws in the South, would require decades of struggle. To quote a leading activist at the time within the Carpenters Union, Peter J. McGuire, the way to get it is by organization. If you want an 8-hour law, make it yourself. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the 8-hour day movement, which directly gave birth to May Day, traces back to the movement in the US that started after the Civil War, and it saw a huge upsurge in the 1880s. The movement for an 8-hour day really picked up steam in this time. There was an uptick in strikes in 1885 and 1886. And in this period, we saw a number of local labor organizations unify on a national scale. And there was a mood for a national federation of all these unions. So this resulted in the formation of the predecessor to the American Federation of Labor, which set as its main task to win the 8-hour workday. To this end, the Union Federation declared that May 1st, 1886 would be the day when workers nationally would cease to work more than 8 hours, implicitly calling for a general strike. While hundreds of thousands of workers participated in the strike across the country, the May 1st strike was most aggressive and widespread in Chicago, which was at that time the center of a militant left-wing labor movement. The fight carried on for longer than just a single day. In the face of Chicago's strike, the response of the ruling class was a murderous police attack on unarmed strikers on May 3rd, which left 6 dead and many more wounded. The bosses hoped to destroy the movement's leaders and the entire growing labor movement in Chicago as an extension. The next day, workers met at a meeting point called Haymarket Square to protest this police violence. The meeting was peaceful, but as it was ending, the police again attacked the workers. In the mix of things, an unidentified person threw a bomb into the crowd, killing a sergeant and resulting in further violence and deaths. The throwing of the bomb was the pretext for mass arrests and the trial of the strike movement's leaders. These people were prosecuted the following year despite massive national and international protests. So despite being met sharply by the opposing force of the ruling class, the 8-hour day movement was largely successful. It's been estimated that about half of the workers who struck nationwide on May 1st won their demands, and where they didn't win an 8-hour day, they succeeded in reducing their work hours. But the violent methods of the bosses in Chicago was a signal to action to all the bosses all over the country. In the second half of 1886, there was a concentrated offensive of the employers, determined to destroy the reforms that the workers had won and to regain the position they had lost during the wider strike movement of 1885 and 1886. The execution of the leaders of the movement in Chicago in response to the Haymarket Massacre was a huge setback for the whole movement. But the movement drove on and sought much needed international solidarity. In 1888, the newly founded American Federation of Labor called for another strike, demanding to extend the 8-hour workday to all workers. In 1889, the AFL sent a delegate to the founding conference of the Second International, which is a grouping of leaders from workers' organizations across the world to call for international action. It was this founding conference that organized the first ever simultaneous international workers' demonstration on May Day, 1890. Initially, this international action for the 8-hour day was planned to be a one-time event, but the organizers found that continued actions to fight for the 8-hour day were necessary. And even after this initial goal was won, May Day was not given up. The fight wasn't over. As the revolutionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg reflected, as long as the struggle of the workers against the ruling class continues, as long as all demands are not met, May Day will be the yearly expression of these demands. Entering the turn of the century, more and more, May Day demonstrations across the globe became demonstrations of working class power. Open street fighting with the police and military took place across important industrial centers. And while the workers' movement encountered some setbacks due to the brutal repression it faced, it kept building. Chicago, for example, despite the consequences of the Haymarket Massacre, continued to be a center of industrial and socialist militancy. Chicago was the center of the first national railroad strike in 1894. The founding convention of the Industrial Workers of the World met in Chicago in 1905. And huge battles ensued to organize the meatpacking and steel industries here in the 1910s and 1930s. So the tradition of May Day continued on unevenly in different parts of the world. While the reformist leaders of the various parties tried to turn May Day demonstrations into days of rest and recreation instead of days of struggle, in many countries, May 1st never ceased to be a day of worker action. Over time, however, May Day was defanged in its birthplace in the US. In post-World War II, May Day was not really celebrated in the States at all. During the Cold War era, May Day was portrayed to US workers as a Russian event and was subjected to intense red baiting. There was a real disconnect between US politics and the politics of the rest of the world throughout that period, and this led to a collective forgetting of the history and celebration of May Day. In 2006, however, the US saw a reawakening of the militant tradition of May Day. That year, on May 1st, there was a massive Day Without an Immigrant strike in which millions of immigrant workers took to the streets to fight for their rights in what was the largest protest and boycott in the US in decades. These marches showed to the larger US working class that there was still a fighting spirit alive that could be used to turn May Day back into a day of strike actions. From 2006, May Day began to be rehabilitated as a day of action in the US, and more people here are now learning about its history and applying its lessons. So today we need to apply the lessons of May Day more urgently than ever. Across the globe, people are losing their jobs and are still being forced to pay rent that they can't afford. In the US, despite laws temporarily banning evictions, landlords are still evicting people. If there's one main lesson to take away from the history of May Day, it's that laws won't be enough to protect us, and that the organized fight back of working people is what's actually going to prevent us from getting evicted. This is why Socialist Alternative in the US is calling for tenants to talk to their neighbors, to get organized, and to engage in rent strikes on May 1st. We're also seeing this sort of organization happening in people's workplaces, even amid the current pandemic. So today, workers in the US at Amazon, Whole Foods, Instacart, Walmart, FedEx, Target, and Shipt are all walking off the job to protest their employer's failure to provide basic protections for workers who are risking and losing their lives at work. These same companies have been making record profits throughout the crisis, and they've made it clear that they're not going to do anything to protect their employees unless their hands are forced. So today we're seeing a bit of the radical history of May Day continue to be revived in the US. We should use this as a jumping off point to build bigger struggle in the days and the years to come. So I'm excited to hear about the fights that are being waged right now in your part of the world. Solidarity from Chicago.
Thank you so much for that, Hannah. I think it was a fantastic contribution, which I think really showed the incredibly rich history that there is for the socialist and trade union movement in the United States. And I think those examples of workers fighting back are so important for us to gather inspiration for what is going on in our part of the world as well. And I think it highlights the importance of internationalism and that the fight back can't just be limited to one country, but also must be global as well. And on the question of workers fighting back, it brings us nicely onto our next two speakers, who are going to talk about two very key disputes that are taking place in the UK at the moment. So the first speaker will be Fiona, who's from the UCU. Fiona.
Hello, everybody. I want to first of all start by giving solidarity greetings to workers around the world on May Day. Really, this coronavirus pandemic has shown us once again there's the huge contradictions and complete inadequacy of the capital system. We've got essential workers, people who are deemed essential still out at work, who are some of amongst the most lowest paid in society. We've got the disgraceful lack of personal protective equipment that is just not being addressed at all. In my sector, in the university sector, I think it's really highlighted as well the essential work of people at the universities in training future doctors, in training nurses, engineers, mathematicians who are doing the modelling of the virus, carrying out research and development of medical equipment and other things. And there's a very wide variety of staff involved in this work. And obviously you've got some expert professors at the top, but you've also got an awful lot of teaching research staff and support service staff who were involved. And we're all involved in that work, and we're all essential. Despite that, and despite this work that we do, we've been facing increasing attacks on our jobs, on our pay, and on our conditions. We've had a 20% real terms pay cut since 2009 to do with below inflationary pay increases, basically. There are proposals on the table for our pensions, or they were on the table, that would mean an average about £200,000 lost in retirement for workers. There's also a huge gender pay gap that opened up, and it's some measures saying it's about 16% in that as well. And there are other pay inequalities at the university sector as well. We've been going through a rampant period of casualisation, increased use of hourly paid staff, increased use of short fixed term contracts, people getting contracts for maybe 9 months, maybe a year, maybe less than that. And we're also suffering unbearable increases in workload. There was a survey not too long ago that said on average, academic workers at universities are working about 60 hours per week. And it links back to what Hannah was saying. Some of the original struggles that sparked May Day had this 8-hour day as a key demand, and we're still having to fight on for that demand. And we are fighting back on that. In the university sector, we had a pensions dispute in 2018, almost exactly 2 years ago. We did 14 days then of escalating strike action, and we actually managed to force the employers to stop in their tracks with proposed cuts to our pension. But unfortunately, there's not been any resolution on pensions. We're still in dispute on that. We've also got into dispute over some of the other issues I just mentioned, our forfeits dispute, which are on pay, workload, casualisation, and pay inequality. And for those disputes, the forfeits and the pensions disputes, recently we took 22 days of strike action, and in the end, it was a total of 74 universities that were involved in that strike action. And obviously, striking in winter in particular, it is not easy at all. I'm at Manchester, where it's notoriously rainy, bad weather, and it certainly lived up to that. But we had a really, really strong showing on picket lines. We had picket lines all our buildings, and that was shown around the universities as well who were involved. We had marches, demonstrations, we had big mass meetings, and the strike action was really solid. We were pushing the employers into further negotiations. We were making progress in those negotiations as well. And there was a clear need for us to escalate our action and reballot, but the plans were postponed due to the lockdown by the union. We were then obviously, due to the lockdown, the universities were increasingly closed down, campuses were shut down. We were thrown into online teaching at a very, very short notice. We're also finding that recruitment's been frozen, research funding's been thrown into doubt. Fixed term staff in particular are not getting contracts renewed. Some people are coming up to their contracts finishing in the next couple of months with no hope of getting a renewal on that as well. And basically the business models that have been used in higher education are based on student numbers, tuition fees coming in, and these business models are becoming unstuck, meaning there's huge potential losses in universities' income that they're expecting. We're basically being told in the university sector now to brace ourselves for cuts, and some universities are going to be hit harder than others depending on their individual business models. Now, two key national campaigns are emerging outside of the kind of official union structures to defend jobs. We've got the Corona contracts campaign, which is looking at demands around fixed term staff, and that's now been taken up nationally. And a campaign is emerging for teaching assistants like myself. So basically, we're finding that precarious workers are getting together to fight to fight against those cuts and to defend the jobs. And it's clear, really, that attacks like these are going to be becoming more and more prevalent, not just in universities, but in workplaces in general, as we workers are being made to pay the price of the pandemic. It's clear as well that in that case, worker solidarity is going to be essential, and it's also alive and kicking. During our recent strike, our recent 22 days, we had visits on picket lines from a very large number of workers, local trade unionists coming along to offer support, offer solidarity, offer hot drinks, offer food. We had lots of speakers at our rallies offering support and solidarity. A group of us actually from Manchester went actually around visiting workplaces to discuss the disputes and to appeal for solidarity along with the local trades council, and we got a really, really excellent response, some often turning up unannounced and speaking to people, and it was really inspiring. And we were invited to speak at many different trade union branches as well about our disputes. Obviously, for us in universities, we got an amazing amount of support from the students, and it really was vital for us. It kept up our spirits on the picket lines, and obviously we were able then to discuss why we were striking, why we were fighting on those issues, and also that we were fighting against the marketisation of education as a whole and how this was directly important for the students themselves. We also received lots of messages of support from universities around the world, which was again really inspiring. I think this crisis has made it even more clear that it's workers on the ground and in the workplaces, not the bosses, not the politicians, who are essential to the running society. We must urgently band together to fight in our interests. We also need to challenge how society is run more general and how it could be run in our interests and to meet our needs. We need to organise and we need to build and fight for a social society that is run democratically, put the needs of the majority first, not those few at the top who benefit from all of our hard work. solidarity.
Thank you very much for that, Fiona. I think rightly at the moment there's been a lot of focus on the situation with the NHS, but we need to also remember that the problems of marketisation in the education sector are very, very important for Socialists to look at. And Socialist Alternative were very proud to support the picket lines of UCU, and we'll no doubt do so in the future. So that leads us on to our next speaker, who is Rob MacArdle, a member of Socialist Alternative and the Communication Workers Union in Coventry. As people may know, there's been a big dispute with Royal Mail for a prolonged period of time. And Rob's going to talk a little bit about that and the situation facing postal workers today. So over to you, Rob.
Hello, I'm honoured to be speaking at this Socialist Alternative virtual May Day rally today. And our postal service has been at the heart and fabric of our society for over 500 years. And in that time, we've seen a fair number of disputes and battles. But the CWU has a proud history of standing up and defending its members. Over the last year, we've faced an employer that has opted to tear up the 2017 Four Pillars of Security Agreement and disengage with the workforce and union. The agreement covered things like a pension solution for all, protection for workers against things like 0 hours, and a shorter working week without the loss of pay. Instead, the new CEO, Rico Batt, has chosen to show what Royal Mail is really about. For them, it's about their profits rather than people. And this is a man that's based in Switzerland on a £2.7 million reward package and received a £6 million golden hello. Previously, he built up GLS Parcels in Europe, and it's now owned by Royal Mail. And it was known for its anti-union, cheap labour model and a culture of bullying management tactics. So much so that a German undercover media investigation labelled it as modern-day slavery. And this is the kind of business model that Rico Batt wants for postal service here in the United Kingdom, and a reason why as trade unionists and as socialists, we've got to fight back to oppose this. In 2019, CWU members smashed the anti-trade union threshold with a massive 97.1% yes vote in its strike balance, a testament of how a union can effectively engage with its members through social media, mail, gate meetings, and a strong militant leadership. Royal Mail instead ran to the High Court for an injunction against industrial action. And instead of resolving the issues that workers face, they rewarded managers with a 5.7% pay deal for 2 years and a £1,000 bonus, while saying to us they couldn't afford to reduce our working week by 1 hour. And yet they have found £1.5 billion to give to shareholders since privatisation in 2013. Since then, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was the CWU and its members that took a stand to ensure that workers felt safe in the workplace. The union backed up offices that felt unsafe due to the lack of PPE and that walked out over health and safety fears. Several offices did walk out, including Didcot in Oxfordshire, where a postal worker had tested positive for COVID-19. The deep clean of the office included a man with a rag and a spray gun. Workers rightly stayed out until they got proper results. Attacks continue, and even this week, between National Postal Workers' Day and Workers' Memorial Day, Royal Mail took executive action to impose their will on saying that there would be no delivery of letters on a Saturday, breaking the universal service obligation. And one of the reasons why they wanted to do this was because they hate having to deliver letters 6 days a week. Because by reducing it by 1 day, they could wipe out 20,000 jobs. But the union didn't sit back and do nothing. In very short notice, the union had had drummed up the support, if you like, of the whole labour force within the CWU. And just in the last 2 hours, we've had a positive result that this would indeed be a temporary measure for 6 weeks, reviewed every 2 weeks, no loss of jobs, no loss of pay, and workers do not have to change their work hours. So it's a victory for the CWU. I've highlighted quickly some of the issues that we're facing, but our struggle is international. Already the big corporations are calling for an early end to the lockdown, and many have resumed production at the risk to many workers. A Resolution Foundation report this week found that women were twice as likely to be in low-paid jobs, and 2 out of 5 being working mums amongst the 8.5 million key workers in the UK. Women should not be made to pay for this crisis. Young people, 40% of 16 to 24-year-olds, were employed in the businesses that were the first to close down during the pandemic. This same report says that a disproportionate number will become unemployed. Young people did not cause this crisis. And just like in the 2007-2008 banking crisis, it is capitalism that is sick. We must not let workers pay the price again. And yet we're already seeing the likes of BT threatening to cut 12,000 jobs, Debenhams abandoning their workers in Ireland, and greedy companies like P&O Ferries begging the government for £150 million. And this is after they furloughed 1,400 staff. And yet they're preparing to hand over £270 million to shareholders. This is a company owned by Dubai-based DP World, whose boss was paid £5.4 million last year. This should make you angry, but anger on its own won't change the situation. And this is why we need to join a union wherever we can, get active, and put pressure on unions to act, just like we've seen that the CWU have acted. But as I said, our struggle is international, and Socialist Alternative are active in over 30 countries around the world. We're fighting this rotten system, and we're seeking to replace it with a democratically run society by workers and for workers who can plan production for the benefit of all. Join us. Solidarity.
Thank you very much for that, Rob. It was a fantastic update about the situation taking place in Royal Mail at the moment. And I think once again, it shows who the real key workers are. No doubt that the struggle with Royal Mail will continue, and Socialist Alternative will continue to support the postal workers and put forward a militant and fighting strategy for the Communication Workers Union. So thank you very much for that, Rob. So our next speaker is going to be Yara from North London. Yara is a member of Socialist Alternative, and is going to make a short contribution about how we build a Socialist Alternative. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Paul. And really, those were some fascinating contributions that we've just heard. I'm sure the next contribution is also going to be great. I think workplace struggles are unbelievably important, and especially in the context of this pandemic. And it's honestly a privilege to be listening to such incredible activists from so many unions. And I think it really stresses the role that the unions have to play in this fight against a system that exploits us all and has done so since its inception. Now, those poor conditions that we're hearing about are not anecdotal. They're the reality of many, many workers during this pandemic, which has really highlighted the power relations in society. But those power relations didn't start with COVID-19, and it's not COVID-19's fault. It's the ruling class's fault. The fault of a system that's built for profit rather than for the health and safety of people. It's the fault of the capitalist system. Throughout history, we've seen workers' struggles, including the one this day is based on, like we've heard from Hannah. And those struggles have won us some victories, like paid holiday, the 8-hour workday, the minimum wage, and so many more. But this crisis has illustrated clearly how those victories can be taken away at any point. Around the world, we've seen governments and bosses call essential workers heroes, at the same time as they're taking away their rights and demanding them to work long hours for little to no pay for the public good, because we're all in this together. But the fact is, we're not in this together. When the capitalist class is stretched thin, like it is now, it will first and foremost attack the working class and our hard-earned rights. It's not because they're evil geniuses. It's because they're backed by a system that supports their interests at our expense. That's why connecting all of these workplace struggles to a focused mass fight back against the capitalist system is vital if we want to build a society that's free of exploitation. Without getting rid of the capitalist system and building a socialist world that's based on the democratic organization of the working class, we will always be fighting for our health, we'll always be fighting for our dignity, and against the oppression that has been made so obvious during this crisis that is endemic to capitalism. Now, this crisis hasn't stopped us. Even under severe lockdown, as we're hearing, we've still been fighting. Protests around the world have been happening in new, innovative ways. We've been hosting rallies and meetings like this one, which everyone can access through their phone or through their computer anywhere in the world. Socialist Alternative has also been publishing a paper that's available in PDF form to comply with the lockdown. But this crisis is going to end at some point, and the lockdown will be over. And the struggle for socialism will keep on going, even more intensely than before. The crucial need for a socialist organization that will push and build this mass struggle against capitalism and for socialism is more apparent than ever. But in order to have a functioning organization like that during the crisis, but especially after, we require some funds. Before the lockdown, Socialist Alternative spent around £2,000 a month on average just on printing materials and travel. So that doesn't include paying organizers, software, hardware costs, and so on. Now, we predict that those costs will grow rapidly after the crisis. We have new members in areas that we don't have any branches in. This will mean an increase in our travel costs. The high potential of this period to become explosive and bring about mass movements and demonstrations means that we will probably need more materials, more banners, placards, leaflets. So in other words, highlighting socialist ideas in a capitalist world is expensive. As we aren't backed by any capitalist overlords, we rely solely on small donations from our members and supporters. So people like you watching it, if you agree with what you're hearing today and agree that a socialist transformation of society is the only way to bring about the necessary lasting change that we've been talking about today, then Socialist Alternative appeals to you. Please help us. Can you donate £1, £5, £20? Seriously, any amount will help us build the resistance that's so essential right now, and also in post-coronavirus world. So we've already seen some appreciated donations, and I want to take a minute to read out some of them to show our appreciation. It's not all of the ones that we've been sent so far, but I want to highlight a couple. So we've got Kieran from Grimsby, who donated £10. Thank you, Kieran. Drew and Julie from Leicester donated £60. Thank you so much. We've got Tim from Brighton, who donated £30, which is incredible. And Hugh from Manchester donated £50. Thank you so much. Now, we've also had an anonymous donation of £100, which we're so grateful about. This particular member saved on bus costs during the lockdown and decided to donate the money that they saved. So thank you so much to this anonymous donor. And maybe you can do that too. Maybe you can think about how much money you've saved during this lockdown on not going to the pub, or saving up on transport costs, and see if you can maybe donate the money to this cause. Or can you match this donation? Or can you even top this donation? Please join this fantastic list of people. Use the link in the comments below to donate. Even if it's less than £100, we'll still accept it. And don't forget to tell us that you've donated in the comments, please. We want to know and we want to thank you. So thank you so much, and I'll give it back to Paul.
Thank you so much for that, Yara, and thank you for everyone so far for making donations. Every penny and pound is hugely appreciated as we go forward in building Socialist Alternative. And I just want to raise something as well. Yara mentioned that we produce a newspaper today, which is very apt on International Workers' Day. We have brought out issue 7 of our monthly newspaper. You can find out more about it on our Facebook page, and I'm sure someone will put more details in the chat as well. So please do get a copy and read more about what we're saying. Now, our final speaker tonight is going to be Chaz Berry. Chaz is an activist with Socialist Alternative and the National Association of Probation Officers. So over to you, Chaz.
Thank you, Paul. Well, May Day greetings from Kent and Medway Socialist Alternative, and also from my branch of Napo, the Probation Workers Union in Kent, Surrey and Sussex. Probation workers are designated key workers, and many of them are working directly with prisoners and service users resettling in the community, as well as victims of violent and sexual crimes. And this is an extremely challenging time for our members who are working hard to keep the public safe. So solidarity both to and from probation workers across the world. Some of us will be receiving extra payments for danger money for working directly with service users. And I want to pledge my first £150 danger money towards Socialist Alternative as part of this May Day appeal. Now, we've heard today some really important messages about the significance of May Day. We've heard first of all about its origins in Chicago, not just as a dry piece of history, but as part of a living struggle by workers for the 8-hour day. We've heard directly from workers engaged in struggle right now in the universities and in the Royal Mail and the Postal Service to protect the security of their jobs and their conditions. And we should use May Day to remind us that contrary to what the bosses tell us, history is not made by individuals, but it's made by movements that represent the class interests of those involved. As workers, we're bound together across space and time by the collective interests, our collective interests as producers of the real wealth in society, because we're the only class that can pose an alternative to the global problems of poverty, inequality, and catastrophic climate change through the struggle for socialism, a socialist society, one which works in the interests of the majority, not for the profits of the few. And we've seen and we've heard how the Covid-19 crisis has brought this historic struggle to an even clearer focus. On the one hand, we've got the capitalist class who've done nothing to prepare for the protection of the general population through the stockpiling of adequate PPE, for example, and workers who in many cases are being forced, as in the United States, to take unofficial industrial action to ensure their safety. We've seen examples of absolute callousness by certain employers when it comes to the health of the workforce. Where I live here in the Medway Towns in North Kent, refuse workers stopped when their employer, a company called Norse, forced them to carry on 3 working in a cab with no PPE. They've had their union de-recognised while the Tory council, who gives Norse the contract, turns its back and says it has nothing to do with them, despite the fact that 2 of the directors are Tory councillors for Medway Council that owns 50% stake in this company. The company's now suspended 8 members of the Union Unite for daring to toot their horns in solidarity with the socially distanced protests that we organised outside that depot. Now, this is the same level of callousness that the employers in the 19th century showed at the birth of the labour movement in Chicago, before we had built the unions, before we built the labour movement. On Workers' Memorial Day, a few days ago, Medway Trades Council held a socially distanced protest outside the Norse Depot in Gillingham. And in the evening, we held a virtual meeting which was addressed by workers in dispute with Norse. as well as those in the front line of the fight against COVID-19 in our local hospital. But we also discuss an historic struggle of the match women of Brighton May in East London, just up the road from us. Now, if you don't know who the match women were and why they're important, it's because the ruling class don't want you to know their importance to the history of our struggle and the direct parallels with that struggle with the situation today. In 1888, the match women went on strike when they were forced to work in a dangerous environment that gave them a horrendous condition called fuzzy jaw. They were regarded as ignorant, as trash, not worthy of protection, just like the refuse workers here in Medway. There were women working piecemeal, part-time, who were thought incapable of organising. They were looked down on like many of those working in nursing homes in social care today. But they won that dispute, and that dispute became the inspiration of the great dock strike of 1889, the following year at the Port of London. The great dock strike, which is widely acknowledged to have been the start of mass trade unionism in Britain, coinciding with what was going on in Chicago. Now, thankfully, we don't have to build our trade unions from scratch like the match women and the dockers. But we do have to think about how we're going to build the sort of leadership able to respond to this level of callousness and aggression that is coming from the employers in the current period. Militancy, unfortunately, doesn't drop from the sky. It takes patience amongst workers building at the grassroots who are learning through collective action and develop the leadership of tomorrow. And I think this raises important questions about the sorts of demands we should be putting forward, not only to protect workers now, but over the coming weeks and months, as workers come under increasing pressure to maintain services in the face of what is widely predicted to be the biggest world economic slump since the 1930s. And I think the original demand for the 8-hour day is really instructive. It popularized the slogan of 8 hours of work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what you will. It raised the expectation of workers for what a decent society should be like: security, rest, recreation. What the UCU and the CWU disputes of today, what we're seeing is a similar attempt by workers to push back against the precariousness of employment sector by sector. But really, this is not nearly enough. It needs to be generalized into a campaign that will inspire workers to go on the offensive across what is likely to be a catastrophic post-COVID landscape. In particular, we should be exposing how the private ownership of social care, health logistics, and the agencies that are there to protect the environment, such as refuse collection, how that is the privatization of those services has made us ill prepared for this pandemic. It's only the public ownership under control of workers and healthcare professionals that will safeguard us against future pandemics. But I think we should be raising our sights even higher and raising the expectations of workers across the whole of society about what would be possible if all of the key industries were organized under democratic workers' control. We could then be moving beyond just guaranteeing the health and the welfare of the existing population, but starting to plan to deal with some of the urgent problems, such as climate change that threaten future generations of our planet. We could improve the quality of our cities and enhance the skills and abilities of everyone, not just the privileged few. This will need political leadership that is currently lacking at the head of the Labour Party in the UK and of the Social Democratic parties elsewhere. Socialist Alternative has raised the idea in Britain of conferences of resistance to try to draw together those forces moving into struggle in the next period. But it's important to remember, this isn't something that can just come together simply by proclaiming it in the abstract. It has to be something that's built based on the real forces where they exist on the ground. Where are those forces going to come from? COVID-19 is teaching a new generation of workers that the employers and their political representatives, the Tories, are not interested in our health and well-being. They're learning that the unions are our last line of defence, and with militant leadership, they can build a mass movement capable of socialist change. Socialist Alternative will be there to help wherever we can to forge that new leadership. Join us, be part of it. Venturemos.
Thanks very much for that, Chaz. I thought it was a really good analysis of the situation. It was also disgusting to hear about the situation of the workers in Kent being victimised for supporting action at the moment. So I think I'd like to thank all the speakers for their contributions this evening. It's been really fantastic to hear your thoughts and experiences about the situation that you're facing in your various unions and how we can fight for socialism. As various speakers have said, I think what this situation has shown, really more than ever, is the working class are the real key workers in society, not the bankers or politicians. And it's the working class that have the enormous potential power to change things. I think it's that power of the organised working class combined with a socialist programme that we in Socialist Alternative believe is the key to building a movement to take on capitalism, which, as we know, is a system that causes climate change, puts profit before health, causes racism, sexism, and all forms of oppression. And I think we need a socialist society where the world's vast resources are democratically owned and planned for human need, not private profit. But to do that, we need an organisation. And if you agree with what you've heard this evening, I'd urge you to join Socialist Alternative and with our sister organisations and International Socialist Alternative to help us build that powerful socialist movement across the planet to end capitalism and all forms of oppression. So thanks again for attending. Just want to thank as well everyone who's made a donation tonight. Already we've had over £1,000 donated, which is absolutely fantastic and really go towards strengthening the fight for socialism. So please visit the links that have been put in the chat, including our website, socialistalternative.net, like our social media pages, get a copy of our newspaper and help us build the fight back against capitalism. So thanks again for coming along. We hope to see you at future Socialist Alternative events. Solidarity.